Continue.
Okay, you can hear me well, right? So I'm going to talk today about Love's Labour's Lost in the context of Russian-English relations, which is the subject of my book, Shakespeare, Elizabethan England. Love's Labour's Lost is often called an enigma of dramatic history because despite of numerous annotated editions and many scholarly studies, it still remains the subject of intense speculation and conjecture. Indeed, there are many issues that make this play more difficult to interpret than perhaps any other Shakespeare work. Usually, three problems are brought up by scholars. The first one is the play's plot, or rather lack of it, as there is very little dramatic action. The plot is unresolved, and the ending is postponed for a year, or as Shakespeare put it, for 12 months and a day. This ending is a surprise, as the play was performed during the joyous Christmas season. Diego de Silva, a Spanish ambassador at Queen Elizabeth's court, noted that the comedies there always ended in matrimony. The reason for this, according to the Queen herself, was to induce her to marry. Love's Labour's Lost is called a comedy, but unlike other comedies, it does not end in marriage or have a happy ending. Not only is there no encouragement to marry, but on the contrary, this is a play in which Shakespeare allows women to gain control over men. It is therefore not surprising that Love's Labour's Lost is considered Shakespeare's most feminist play. The second problem, and maybe I should put, I'm just going to share the screen so you could see the cover, the cover of the original first edition. So the second problem, as I was saying, in interpreting the play is the lack of known sources, because the play is not based on a single source or on a previous work. But the greatest difficulty is the third problem, which lies in the play's language and its linguistic complexity. The play is oversaturated with multi-layered puns, malapropisms, distortions of Latin words and phrases. It also contains turns of speech that have multiple meanings, and it is full of numerous enigmatic topical allusions. No other work of Shakespeare's is so linguistically rich. Language is the main feature of the play and not its action or plot. My interpretation is that the play closely mirrors actual comic and tragic events in Anglo-Russian relations, and that Shakespeare captured and immortalized in it much of a largely forgotten Tudor history. Seen in this light, the above-mentioned problems fade into something much easier to understand. We know that only two performances of the play are on record, one sometime in the late 1590s and one during the 1604 season. Both took place at court, the first performance for the court of Queen Elizabeth and the second one for King James and his wife, Queen Anne of Denmark. Increasingly, scholars believe that Love's Labour's Lost was written specifically for the court and not for public theatre. Most scholars have accepted a traditional interpretation that it is a Shakespeare's so-called French play, as it is set in France, and has 5 male characters in it whose names are associated with the French wars of religion. Then we have the Masque of the Russians in Act 5, for which this play is famous. Here, for the first time in Shakespeare, we come across Russians, well, mock Russians, I should say. Although the masque introduces a strong Russian component, mostly comical, I argue that the play is at least as much about Russia as it is about France, and that to understand the real meaning of Love's Labour's Lost, we need to rediscover the captivating story of Russian-English relations in the second half of the 16th century. If we take the play at face value, it is a frivolous comedy of manners in which the appearance of masquerading Russians in the play's fifth act can easily be dismissed as a kind of historical curiosity, showing contemporary English contempt for the primitive Russians. However, I think a more accurate description is that Love's Labour's Lost is a sophisticated Elizabethan romp, deeply concerned with current foreign affairs, international trade, and royal courtship. Shakespeare's lifetime coincided with a very exciting time, and we need to pay more attention to the historical context in which he lived and wrote. The 16th century was a great age of discovery, of distant voyages, of enterprise, and of commerce. Exploration was driven by the dire state of the English economy, which was a result of several factors, such as Henry VIII's gross fiscal mismanagement, the expense of keeping England independent of Spain, and the loss of Calais, which dealt a devastating blow to the cloth industry, woolen cloth being the main item of English export. When the Elizabethan age began, England desperately needed new markets. The main promoters of exploration and discovery were English merchants. They knew that England was lagging behind Portugal and Spain in exploration and wanted to join the race in order to get to the fabulous riches from the East, among them treasured spices such as cinnamon, nutmeg, and peppers, which were needed for preserving meat and other foodstuffs in an age prior to refrigeration. The English therefore desperately needed to find a sea route to the Far East so that they could buy directly from China, India, and the so-called Spice Islands. The 1550s broke the prior isolation of two countries, England and Russia, both situated on the periphery of Europe. Their aligned history began in 1553. That year, 3 ships set out from England in search of the northeast passage to China. Although only 1 ship survived, it accidentally ended up on the shores of the White Sea in the Russian north, beginning the fateful encounter with Muscovy, as Russia was then called. Richard Chancellor, the leader of the expedition, managed to reach Moscow, where he was wined and dined by the country's ruler, Ivan IV, Grozny, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Here he is. Ivan immediately saw the advantages of trade with England and proceeded to grant the English unprecedented trading privileges. The Tsar was surrounded by enemies and constantly at war with his neighbors. He was badly in need of ships, weapons, and various specialists. All this England could readily provide. England, in turn, would benefit from Russia's raw materials, such as wax, leather, tallow, flax, and hemp, and find a lucrative market for its woolen cloth. What followed was a 90-year-long Anglo-Russian exchange, which was comical and tragical at the same time. The relationship was so intense and so bizarre that Nikolai Bestuzhev-Ryumin, a 19th century historiographer in charge of putting together a comprehensive history of Russia, said that the Ivan-Elizabeth's relationship required someone of the caliber of Shakespeare to do it justice. The Russian historian had no idea that Shakespeare did, in fact, take up this challenge by weaving in this story into the fabric of one of his comedies, Love's Labour's Lost. 1555 saw the formation of the Muscovy Company. This was the first limited liability company, and hence the foundation stone of modern capitalism. Many other trading companies would model themselves on it in the future. The Muscovy Company was a remarkable institution for its time. This is where the English court and commerce overlapped. Over 10% of the founding members of the company were high-ranking courtiers and the country's elite. The list of their names reads like a who's who of the Elizabethan court. To name but a few: Elizabeth's right-hand man, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh; her favorite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester; her spy master, Francis Walsingham; the treasurer, Christopher Hatton. All these Queen's men were actively involved in trade with Russia and had personal financial stakes in the success or failure of the company's expeditions. Elizabeth herself was personally involved and would lend her own ships to the company. At that time, there was no distinction between the Queen's personal assets and that of the country's treasury. Prosperous voyages meant that she was personally enriched. Because of navigation issues and bad weather conditions, both the English envoys in Russia and the Russian envoys in England stayed in their respective countries for up to a year. This gave both countries and their rulers a chance to get to know each other more closely. So the Queen and her court were familiar with the Russian envoys, their behavior, their customs, their expectations, as well as their elaborate outfits, all of which to English seemed strange and rather similar to clothes worn in Turkey, the country that was considered both exotic and barbaric. Trade at the time was the motivating force behind political alliances and was often accompanied by marriage proposals. Much is known about Elizabeth's French and Austrian marriage negotiations. They were so numerous that one Spanish ambassador referred to them as Elizabeth's pastime. Much less is known about her Russian courtships. Elizabeth welcomed to her court 5 Russian envoys, 4 during the reign of Ivan and 1 during the reign of Boris Godunov. All these visits involved marriage negotiations between the two countries. So the following is an overview of this exchange. First, we have Ivan thinking of marrying Elizabeth. His advances to her began in 1567 and were carried to her court verbally by her first English ambassador to Russia, Anthony Jenkinson. Elizabeth avoided the matrimonial proposal for several years by pretending it must have been a mistake and that Jenkinson, who did not speak Russian, had muddled the Tsar's words. The blame was also put on the translator, who supposedly mistranslated things for Jenkinson. I believe this episode is reflected in the masquerade of the Russians in Act 5 of Love's Labour's Lost. In the following passage, Boyer serves as a go-between in the dysfunctional exchange between the men pretending to be Russian envoys and the princes pretending not to understand what they're saying. And it's a long passage. So Rosaline, who is standing in for the princess, she's pretending to be the princess, says that to Boyer. What would these strangers know their mind, Boyer, if they do speak our language? 'Tis our will that some plain man recount their purposes. know what they would. Boye, to the mock Russians. What would you with the princess? Biron, dressed as Russian. Nothing but peace and gentle visitation. Rosaline. What would they say, they? Boye, nothing but peace and gentle visitation. Rosaline. Why, that they have, and bid them to be gone. Boye, she says you have it, and you may be gone. King, dressed as Russian. Say to her, we have measured many miles to tread a measure with her on this grass. Boye, they say they have measured many a mile to tread a measure with you on this grass. Rosaline, it is not so. Ask them how many inches is in 1 mile. If they have measured many, the measure then of one is easily told. Boye, if to come hither you have measured miles, and many miles, the princess bids you, tell how many inches does fill up 1 mile. Biron, tell her we measure them by very steps. Boye, she has herself. So at this stage, Boye can't stand the charade any longer and resigns his unnecessary appointment as a translator, an interpreter. The second round of Russian-English marriage negotiations, those of 1582, 1583, were also immortalized in Love's Labour's Lost. By then, Ivan had been waiting for over 15 fruitless years for Elizabeth to respond to his marriage proposal. Our wooing does not end like an old play. Jack has not Jill, complains Biron at the end of Love's Labour's Lost. Ivan certainly did not have Elizabeth. Elizabeth's idea was not to agree to marry the Tsar, but to keep him hoping so as to keep the trade going. In the early 1580s, Ivan found himself in difficult political and personal circumstances. In 1581, he lost the Baltic port of Narva to the Swedes, and he knew that the recently concluded peace with Poland would only be temporary. Moreover, in November 1581, he inadvertently killed his oldest son and heir in a fit of rage. That left his sickly and mentally deficient second son, Fyodor, as the heir apparent. In this tense climate of fear and paranoia, England beckoned to Ivan more than ever as a safe haven from personal and political turmoil. Wanting to unite himself with the English royal house, he reached out to Elizabeth again, this time inquiring if she had an unmarried female relative he could propose to. Elizabeth was known to procrastinate, but this time she did not waste any time. In 1581, through her doctor, whom she sent to attend to Ivan, she suggested a different candidate, Lady Mary Hastings, sister of Henry Hastings, the 3rd Earl of Huntingdon. Lady Mary was Elizabeth's very distant relative, but she was presented to Ivan as Elizabeth's niece. Elizabeth's plan worked. Ivan was smitten with the idea of Lady Mary as his next wife, that would make wife number 8, and the new marriage negotiations opened in May 1582. As his ambassador, Ivan chose Fyodor Pisemsky, one of the most experienced and ablest diplomats at the Russian court. Pisemsky was dispatched in the summer of 1582 and reached England that September. He was to renew Ivan's request for a joint offensive and defensive alliance and to request more weapons and military supplies. Pisemsky was also to be a facilitator of the Tsar's romantic endeavors, just as Anthony Jenkinson had been in 1567. Pisemsky was to meet and closely observe Lady Mary Hastings. Ivan instructed him to find out the lady's age and note whether Mary was tall and had fair skin. Pisimsky was to return with her portrait painted on wood or paper. Pisimsky reached England on September 27, 1582. Christopher Carlisle, Lord Admiral of the English Navy, who had sailed from Russia with the Pisimsky party, continued alone to report their safe arrival to the Queen. Elizabeth thus received warning of the imminent arrival of the Russian envoys, just as the princess in Love's Labour's Lost is informed prior to the Masque of the Muscovites. So Boyer runs in, huffing and puffing, and screams, "Prepare, madam, prepare! Arm, wenches, arm! Encounters mounted are against your peace. Love does approach disguise. Arm it in argument, you'll be surprised. Master your wits, stand in your own defense, or hide your heads like cowards and fly hence." Note the mention of arms. That's what Elizabeth was supplying Ivan as her part of the trade bargain. Pisimsky's arrival caused enormous excitement at the English court. Edward Manners, the third Earl of Rutland, reported in one of his letters that there was, I quote, "much ado about the coming of the Emperor of Muscovy's ambassador," end quote. We learned that Pisimsky was not admitted to the Queen for several months. He was told that because she had dismissed the majority of her household as a result of the plague that was raging at the time, Elizabeth was now unable to entertain foreign visitors. In other words, she, like the king in Love's Labour's Lost, I quote, swore out housekeeping. "I hear your grace has sworn out housekeeping," she says to the king. Pisimsky was very frustrated that he could not attend to the Tsar's great matters, the term he used to refer to Ivan's intentions vis-à-vis Lady Mary. He craved to see the Queen. However, instead of being granted an audience with her, Pisimsky was flattered daily with visits from high-ranking court officials and leading merchants of the Muscovy Company. He was constantly kept distracted and entertained. On November 25th, the ambassador was visited by Alderman Richard Barn, the governor of the Muscovy Company, with 17 senior merchants and members of the company. They had come personally to invite him to join a royal hunting party. He was told that Elizabeth, I quote, "out of love for your brother and your lord and great duke, extends you great honor. She sends us to you and ordered us to take you hunting for deer in her special reserves, and she sent her very own hunters and dog masters for you." It is well known and well documented that hunting was one of Elizabeth's favorite sports. She was even painted as the goddess Diana on picture number 4. And goddess Diana was the patron of hunters, as well as the moon. She's alluded to as such in Love's Labour's Lost. Perhaps Elizabeth also wished to display her well-known skills as a huntress to make a strong impression on the Russians. In Act 4 of Love's Labour's Lost, there is a hunting scene in which the princess, who several scholars believe represents Elizabeth, is instructed by her forester where to stand in order to make the fairest shoot. And so the princess says to the forester, "And then, forester, my friend, where is the bush that we must stand and play the murderer in?" And forester tells her, "Hereby, upon the edge of yonder coppice, a stand where you may make the fairest shoot." The princess then laments having to injure the animal more for praise than for purpose. And then she concludes her exchange with the forester with a phrase that has baffled scholars. A giving hand, though foul, must have fair praise. Although she knew that Ivan was foul, Elizabeth was required to flatter and praise him in conversation with Pisimsky, and to do everything in her power to demonstrate her great respect for the Tsar. Pisimsky noted in his report to Ivan that Elizabeth constantly paid obeisance to him. She stood up every time Ivan's name was mentioned, as well as when she herself spoke of him. She also expressed what must have been a sincere desire to see him in person, and quoted Ivan's letters to Pisimsky verbatim. In other words, she gave Ivan much undeserving praise. Ivan, who was insecure vis-à-vis his status in the West and loved to inflate his own titles, always insisted on great pomp when receiving foreign visitors or sending his own envoys abroad. The longest word in the English language appears in Love's Labour's Lost. Here it is. If you want to know how to pronounce it, ask Gideon. I believe this is a reference to Ivan's verbosity and self-puffery. And as those of you who read my book know, I believe that Armada, to whom this long word refers to, was modeled on Ivan. When Pisimsky was finally invited to Windsor Castle, the attendance at this audience with the Queen was more than impressive. The entire Muscovy company and the whole court were in attendance, and most of the nobles and peers who were present were either past or current members of the Muscovy company. Besides the court members indoors, over 400 people were waiting outside, sumptuously dressed in scarlet, which was the uniform of the Muscovy company. In no sense could Pisimsky accuse Elizabeth of inadequate respect towards his royal master. During Pisimsky's second audience with the Queen in January 1583, the same pomp and the same processions were maintained as before, with the participation of virtually the entire court. The purpose of this particular meeting was finally to discuss the delicate issue of marriage between Ivan and Lady Mary. Elizabeth said to Pisimsky that she loved her brother and would be very happy to be related to him by such family ties. She did, however, express some objections. These were not to do with Ivan's desire to marry again, but rather with the choice of bride. Elizabeth said she knew that Ivan was a great appreciator and connoisseur of female beauty. Unfortunately, said Elizabeth, Lady Mary simply was not beautiful enough for him. The Queen stated that she wanted someone more lovely for her beloved brother and believed he could not be possibly satisfied with a mediocre beauty such as Lady Mary. This was further dissembling on Elizabeth's part, as she knew quite well that Mary was considered to be one of the reigning beauties at the English court at the time. Pisimsky was not deterred by these objections and continued to insist on meeting Lady Mary. Elizabeth explained that Lady Mary was recovering from smallpox, and until her face was fully healed, would not be available neither for the interview with Pisimsky nor to have her portrait painted. Whether this was true or just a ruse to keep Pisimsky at bay, we do not know. But Love's Labour's Lost provides a fascinating clue. Rosaline says to one of the other ladies in waiting, Oh, that your face were not so full of O's, referring to smallpox scars. The princess cuts in with the words, a pox of that jest. If the pretense that Lady Mary had smallpox had been a joke on Pisimsky, the court would have fully appreciated it. A number of references to painting and the lack of it in Love's Labour's Lost suggest that the remark about the pox was in fact a jest. Elizabeth successfully prevented Pisimsky from seeing Mary for several months. An audience finally did take place on May 18th, 1583, in the garden of York House. A special tent-like canopy was constructed, one that was not unlike the tent that the king provided for the princess and her ladies in Love's Labour's Lost. Pisimsky was to sit in it, together with Lady Mary's brother, the 3rd Earl of Huntingdon. Lady Mary then arrived, surrounded by young ladies and gentlemen of the court. The meeting occurred during the day, so that Pisimsky might have an excellent look at Mary's features and complexion, all in good light. It was constantly stressed to him that Mary was introduced to him in daylight, thus enabling him to see her true countenance. In other words, nothing was hidden from Pisimsky that might otherwise have been obscured by candlelight. The Queen herself continually insisted that Pisimsky confirm that he had indeed been able to observe Lady Mary carefully and convey it to the Tsar upon his return to Russia. In Love's Labour's Lost, Longueville questions Boyer about Maria's identity. I beseech you a word. What is she in the white? A woman sometimes, as you saw her in the light. Longueville then says, I desire her name, which in addition to wanting to know the name of this lady, there is also a hint here, I think, that he is interested in marrying her. And white, as we know, is the color of virginity and hence of wedding dresses. I believe this is another reference to Ivan's courtship of Lady Mary Hastings in 1582 and 83, hinting at Pisimsky's being reassured by Elizabeth that he was allowed to see Mary not in some dark room, but in the light, as per Ivan's request. There are other references to light and seeing in the play. In contemporary English accounts, there exists only one reference to this meeting. It is found in the memoirs of the English envoy to Russia, Sir Jerome Horsey, entitled The Travels of Sir Jerome Horsey, written sometime between 1590 and Horsey's death in 1623. Horsey's memoir includes a fascinating picture of the event, which enables us to see it from the English perspective. This is a long passage from it. Her Majesty caused that lady, Lady Mary Hastings, to be attended on, with divers great ladies and maids of honor and young gentlemen, the number of each appointed, to be seen by the said ambassador, that is Pisimsky, in York House garden. She, that is Lady Mary, put on a stately countenance accordingly. The ambassador, attended with divers and other noblemen and others, was brought before her ladyship, cast down his countenance, fell prostrate to her feet, ran back from her, his face still towards her, she and the rest admiring at his manner. Said by an interpreter, it did suffice him to behold the angel he hoped should be his master's espouse, commented her angelical countenance, state, and admirable beauty. She after was called by her familiar friends in court the Empress of Muscovy. Note that Longueville in Love's Labour's Lost, that the same person who was told that he saw Maria in the light, wrote a love sonnet to her that begins with these words. And that's on the right. Oh, sweet Maria, Empress of my love, where Empress of my love suggests to me a parody on the words Empress of Muscovy, which I put in bold on the left. It's at the bottom. But let us examine Hawes's description of the meeting more closely. Its relevance to the Russian masque in Love's Labour's Lost cannot be overestimated. There are at least 3 quotations in Love's Labour's Lost that closely mirror the meeting in York House as described by Hawes. Shakespeare had no access to Pisimsky's report, of course, but he seems to be familiar with Hawes's account, and Hawes's account mirrors that of Pisimsky rather closely. The first of these quotations is the opening of Act 5, in which we meet Holofernes and then Nathaniel, who are returning from some kind of feast. Holofernes turns to Sir Nathaniel and says, Satis quod sufficit, which translates as that which suffices is enough in Latin, and implies the proverbial enough is as good as a feast in many languages. This quote is baffling to both scholars and audiences, as there is no indication as to what it refers. It is, however, almost exactly what Pisimsky said while observing Lady Mary. Said by an interpreter, it did suffice him to behold the angel, and so on. The angel he hoped should be his master's spouse. In the next scene, we find the men getting ready to play Russians before the ladies. Unbeknown to them, Boyer overhears what they're doing, saying, he overhears what they're saying and reports to the women that the men are practicing to speak and to act like the Russians. And they're teaching Morse, their herald, what to do and say. The king warns Morse. For, quoth the king, an angel shalt thou see, yet fear not thou, but speak audaciously. So this quote seems to echo Pisimsky's comparison to Mary with an angel. The next 2 lines from the play are also very interesting. The boy replied, an angel is not evil. I should have feared her had she been a devil. So why should Moss be frightened? Hawes's account helps answer that question too. The ambassador was brought before her ladyship, cast down his countenance, fell prostrate to her feet, ran back from her, his face still towards her, she and the rest admiring at his manner. Englishmen who had been to Russia or seen a Russian envoy at court had seen the show of obsequious behavior before. Exactly as performed in Russia, Pisimsky fell down and banged his forehead on the ground before Mary Hastings. This Russian custom performed by sovereigns' loyal subjects to indicate their subjection and obedience was referred to in many envoy accounts both in English and foreign. And here is an example from the book of the account of the travels of the German envoy, Adam Aliarius, who was in Moscow in the early 17th century. And here is a drawing of Palm Sunday in Moscow. Anthony Jenkinson noted tongue-in-cheek that because of this constant beating of their heads against the ground, in front of their icons, in front of their lords and their monarch, of course, the Russians had lumps on their foreheads the size of eggs. In Love's Labour's Lost, this custom is also treated comically. Boyer reports to the princes that while practicing how to act as Russians, the men also practiced falling down. I quote, "With this, they all did tumble on the ground, just as Pisimsky fell down at Lady Mary's feet." It is easy to imagine the impression Pisimsky made by his obeisance on the ladies and gentlemen of the court, crashing down at Lady Mary's feet, then rising and running backwards from her because no one was allowed to turn their back on the monarch. His behavior must have looked devilish to them and those around her. This only reinforced the English view that the Russian religion was somewhat of the devil. Horsey's observation that the courtiers present there were admiring at his manner was diplomacy at its best. Love's Labour's Lost is more direct. The women heap abuses on the men dressed as Russians, deriding outright their shallow shows, badly written speeches, and ridiculous behavior. They call them fat, gross, and slow-witted. Rosaline suggests to the princes that even after the men removed their Russian habits, the lady should continue to mock them. "Good madam, if by me you'll be advised, let mock them still, as well known as disguised. Let us complain to them what fools were here, disguised like Muscovites in shapeless gear, and wonder what they were, and to what end their shallow shows and prologue vilely penned, and their carriage so ridiculous, should be presented at our tent to us." Ivan's ardor for marriage into English royalty was only matched by the Muscovy Company's pursuit of trading privileges and defense of their extremely favored position in Russia. When it came to the protection of her own interests, Elizabeth did not hesitate to make demands on behalf of the Muscovy Company. Her agenda with Pisimsky consisted of 3 items. Firstly, she wanted the reinstatement of the monopoly of the Muscovy Company's trade with Russia. Secondly, the right to import and export goods duty-free. These were privileges promised but often revoked by Ivan at whim. And thirdly, the return of the company's use of the Russian mainland for trade with Persia. Elizabeth truly believed that all this was England's right as the discoverers of Russia in 1553. For her part, Elizabeth did not want to concede anything to the Russians. She did not agree to marry the Tsar, nor did she grant the same tax-free privileges to Ivan's representative in London that she was demanding for her own merchants in Moscow. Elizabeth was just like the princess in Love's Labour's Lost, who wanted to secure the trade for herself, but to concede nothing to others. There is no such sport as sport by sport overthrown, to make theirs ours and ours none but our own. As far as the English were concerned, Ivan was an oath breaker. He refused to acknowledge England's right to the trade they had sacrificed so much to establish and maintain. He reneged on the pledge he made on numerous occasions to keep England as Russia's preferred trading partner. Even more, Ivan had promised the Muscovy Company a monopoly on trade not only throughout his lifetime, but also throughout the lifetime of his heirs and descendants. It is not surprising, therefore, that Love's Labour's Lost contains more words and expressions concerned with oath-making and oath-breaking than any other Shakespeare play. Elizabeth clearly had no intention of sending away the petrified Lady Mary, who begged to be spared, I quote, dangerous honors of marrying a tyrant with a long history of disposing of used wives. But the ploy had succeeded by extending this drama cum comedy for yet another year. Shakespeare acknowledges that the embassies were a charade. When asked by the king to have patience and wait for the women to consent to marry them in a year's time, Biron observes, "That's too long for a play." Yet the show had to go on if trade with Russia was to continue. By now, the English Navy was dependent on Russian-made rope and sails. By the end of the 1580s, a quarter of the Navy's budget went on Russian rope alone, contributing in no small way to the victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. No remedy was possible for England's loss of the monopoly of trade with Russia, except to keep the idea of a royal Russian-English marriage alive for yet another year. Since the arrangements of the marriage to Lady Mary were left up in the air, Elizabeth needed to place another carrot in front of Ivan's nose in the form of a new royal bride. Another envoy was sent to Russia. Jerome Bowes. He tantalized Ivan, saying that Elizabeth had 10 more unmarried relatives who fitted the bill. But I'm afraid you'll have to read my book to know how it all ended. In conclusion, I hope I managed to convince you that Love's Labour's Lost is not the fluffy comedy of manners it appears to be. Rather, it is an accurate reflection of the era. I love Simon Schama's observation in his book, History of England, that stagecraft is also statecraft. Love's Labour's Lost was exactly that. It reflected current political climate. It did not need literary sources, as Shakespeare was basically satirizing current events. There was no need to make the plot complex, as there was so much going on beneath the surface of the play if you knew which historical events were satirized. To Elizabeth and her court, every detail, every word of the pseudo-Russians and the replies of the ladies in the Masque of the Muscovites would have been pregnant with meaning. The Queen had an excellent first-hand knowledge of Russia, and Shakespeare wove it all together for her in a clever theatrical package. I'll stop here. And we'll have more time for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Greenhill. Thank you so much for your vivid, comprehensive argument. It's just been a delight here. Let me just stop the recording.